Well, good morning. Another beautiful day in Manhattan, Kansas. An inch of rain last night. How can it get any better? We're happy to see our friends from Oklahoma State here. There are 5 students from Oklahoma State that have come up here because they're thinking about doing a Landon lecture series comparable to that at Oklahoma State. So let's give them a big K-State welcome. And then we have 2 state representatives here, Roger Wrights and Sydney Carlin. Please, thank you for coming. And then last night we had a little informal dinner, and the governor wants you to know she really wanted to come here today to hear this lecture, but she had other pressing engagements. But we did spend time with the governor last night and her husband, Gary. And so they renewed acquaintances, that is Senator Daschle and the governor. And of course, we're very happy to have Linda Daschle here. She went to Kansas State. She was Miss K-State, and she is primarily the reason why we're getting the good senator from South Dakota here today to give a Landon lecture. And Linda, welcome back. Thank you, Linda Daschle. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to this 133rd Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were started in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon. Remember, he ran against FDR in 1936 and was a great governor for the state of Kansas. And the person who's building the name of the building, McCain Building, and the late K-State President James McKay. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State to discuss the pressing issues of the day, like we did last week with Senator Pat Roberts, who did an excellent job in his presentation as chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee and as a U.S. Senator. We're very pleased today to welcome U.S. Senator Tom Daschle from the state of South Dakota and the minority leader of the U.S. Senate to the Landon podium to join 132 predecessors in bringing his thoughts and views on important public issues in 2004. Before introducing the senator, I'd like to introduce other members of the platform party. On my left, Dr. Bob Zabel, professor of education and president of our excellent Kansas State Faculty Senate. Bob, thank you very much. Thank you. Next to her, Haley Yurkovich, a junior in finance and student body president. Haley, thank you very much. Now, unfortunately, Ed Seaton, who's been with the Landon Lectures forever, editor-in-chief of the Manhattan Mercury, he could not make it today, and he's very sorry for that. And then next to him, Dr. Charles Reagan, associate to the president and then chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. Chuck, thank you. You know, Chuck and I have been doing this now for 18 years, and I think you know we've had a number of great Americans and people from all over the world to be a Landon lecturer. And so today we have another very important political leader in America. Well, in 1978, Tom Daschle was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served 4 terms. And then, you know, just in those first 8 years was made a part of the Democratic leadership team in the House. In 1986, he won his first U.S. Senate race. In his first year, he was appointed to the very important Senate Finance Committee. That's a very unusual honor for a freshman. In 1988, then the Senate Majority Leader, George Mitchell, you all remember George, named Tom the first ever co-chair of the Democratic Policy Committee. So already he's a rising star. In 1992 and 1998, South Dakotans re-elected Tom Daschle to the Senate by overwhelming margins. In 1994, he was chosen by his colleagues to succeed the retiring Senator George Mitchell as the majority leader of the U.S. Senate. Senator Daschle also serves as a member of the Senate Agricultural Committee. He has written a book about 2 years ago, like no other time, He chronicles in that book, and it was kind of a bestseller there for a couple of years, chronicles the incredible events of the 107th Congress, including the World Trade Center destruction in 1993, the anthrax attack. You know, I mean, we forget all these things, but remember that was in the headlines for weeks, the anthrax attack on his office. And then, you know, the switch of Jim Jeffers from Republican to Independent. So, now he's the Senate Majority Leader. Throughout his career, Senator Daschle has been, like Pat Roberts, a tireless fighter for working families and farm families. At the same time, he has demanded fiscal discipline from Congress and the White House. Over the years, he has been an extraordinary champion for rural America, and he's always been willing to give family farmers and ranchers a voice in the U.S. Congress. Tom Daschle became the first person in his family to graduate from college when he earned a political science degree from South Dakota State University in 1969. After serving 3 years as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force Strategic Air Command, he spent 5 years as an aide to the then South Dakota U.S. Senator James Abourezk. Tom Daschle's wife, Linda, who you just met a few minutes ago, we're so happy, Linda, that you came along, and I know it's really been fun for you to kind of get reacquainted. She hadn't been back to Kansas State since when? Early 80s. So, I mean, she couldn't believe the transformation. Well, she has served as Deputy Director of the Federal Aviation Administration and is a member of the Baker & Baker firm in Washington, D.C., you know, Howard Baker. Well, we welcome you back to Kansas State. Well, please help me welcome the now Minority Leader of the U.S. Senate and the 133rd Landon Lecturer, Senator Tom Daschle. Tom, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. President Wiefeld, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I've been an admirer of John Wiefeld's for almost 30 years. I know you know how fortunate you are to have his leadership as your president, but he has made a mark not only in Kansas, but across the country, especially in the Great Plains, not only in education, but in agriculture and agriculture policy. I treasure our friendship, and it was so rewarding for me to become reacquainted with him last night and today. Dr. Zabel, Haley Yurkovich, distinguished guests, it is an honor to be here as the 133rd Landon Lecturer. Whenever I hear an overly generous introduction, I remind myself of something that happened in the fall of 2001. At the height of security, of course, and post 9/11, one day Linda and I were at work, and a package was delivered to our home and left at our front door. Unfortunately, when we got home that night, we didn't check the front door. We went in the back door, and it was in the middle of the night that our security detail saw a box on our steps. They leaned down to inspect it. They saw a label that said, "Jerk of the Month." Now, this was about a week or so after the anthrax letter arrived in my office. Taking no chances, they called out the bomb squad and the dogs. They were getting ready to destroy the box when they discovered that it contained our monthly shipment of beef jerky from South Dakota. So it wasn't some nut calling me names. I really have been a member of the Jerk of the Month Club. But I much prefer President Wiefeld's overly generous introduction of me this morning. And I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Chuck Reagan, for all that he did to make this visit possible, for his tenacity in making sure that we could find a time that worked for you and for us, and for inviting Lyndon and me here today. I want to thank the K-State faculty and staff and students. I'm also grateful to the community, especially those from Fort Riley, who I'm told are here. During World War II, General George Marshall was asked if America had a secret weapon in the war. He replied, yes, he did. The best secret, he said, are the best darn kids anywhere in the world right here in America. America's soldiers, airmen, Marines are still the best in the world. From Fort Riley to Fallujah, they're carrying a heavy burden today, and we are proud and grateful to each and every one of them. Linda and I are honored and delighted to be here for a lot of reasons because, as John said so well, K-State has always enjoyed a very special place in our hearts, in our family. It was where Linda started her student days and her professional career in aviation, not far from here. She worked at a flight service station here in Manhattan and the director of a regional airlines that was located here. But some of you may not know this. A lot of South Dakotans, actually, are Wildcat fans these days. The reason can be summed up in 2 words: Megan Mahoney. Megan profusely apologized to me. She had to go to class, and true to Megan's form, she just couldn't miss a class, even if it was to have to listen to a United States Senator from South Dakota. But she was the high school basketball player of the year in South Dakota in her senior year. So many scouts came to see her. She added almost as much to the local economy of Sturgis as the bike rally, which is our, our biggest economic roundup in South Dakota every year. But we're incredibly proud of Megan and her teammates this year, co-Big 12 champions. That's just one of 3 Big 12 championships at K-State this year. You've got the best football team in America, and we all congratulate you. And not only that, the best volleyball team in the Big 12 and probably in America. And so we're very excited for you as well. Congratulations to each and every one of the team players in the K-State for making that happen. I know now why my friend Pat Roberts has been happy all year long. He is a K-State fan, as you know, of some degree. He gave a wonderful speech. I read it, and I wish I could have heard it in person just a week ago. And I read in the early part of his speech his reference to me. So let me do something now and get this out of the way. You can stop counting now. I just wanted the bidding and all the early betting to end before I really got into my remarks. But tell Pat that it was down to 2. He's a friend, and I've enjoyed my opportunities to work with him. But it's truly an honor to speak to this prestigious forum this morning. For nearly 4 decades, beginning with Governor Landon's prescient opening address in 1966 on the use of American military power, the Landon Lecture Series has given some of the most distinguished leaders in the world a forum in which to discuss the most important issues of the day. Landon lectures have come from different political parties, different nations. They've addressed different and urgent questions. But there is a thread that runs through every Landon lecture, and that is the shared belief that the best hope for our future lies in the honest, respectful discussion of the challenges facing America at the time. That is why I wrote the book that President Wiefeld referenced in his introduction of me. The 2 years that made up the 107th Congress truly were, as the title says, like no other time in America. The events we experienced, our reactions to those events, changed the world profoundly. And they will continue to shape the world now for years to come, perhaps generations to come. As the minority and then the majority leader of the United States, I had a closer view of those events than all but a handful of people on the entire earth. I decided to write about what I saw and what I heard because I believe that Americans have the courage and intelligence to meet any challenge and to make wise choices about our future, so long as people are given the facts and the opportunity to reason through all the options. The 107th Congress started, as we all remember, with a struggle for power at the highest levels of government. The 2000 presidential election marked the third time, only the third time, in our nation's history that a presidential contest was actually in doubt. And the first time a presidential election was decided by the United States Supreme Court. For 5 weeks, some feared we were poised on the edge of a constitutional crisis, until Al Gore's gracious and patriotic decision to accept the Supreme Court decision. Vice President Gore's decision, I believe, saved our nation severe turmoil. Incredibly, the 2000 election also produced a second electoral tie. And that's the one people aren't as familiar with. It was the first ever 50-50 Senate. 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. Normally, whichever party has the most senators, of course, controls the Senate. They are the majority. Members of the majority party chair the committees. The majority leader decides which bills come to the Senate floor and which don't. And there is no majority when you have a 50-50 Senate. So Senator Lott, who was then the Republican leader, and I had to invent new rules for sharing power in the United States Senate for the first time in over 200 years. Many Washington insiders said that it couldn't be done. And sometimes we feared that that was true. But after 5 weeks of negotiation, we came up with an agreement that was fair and reasonable, and believe it or not, passed the United States Senate unanimously. Given the tie in the presidential race and the 50-50 Senate, the conventional wisdom at the start of the 107th Congress was that President Bush would have to pursue a moderate agenda. Conventional wisdom, as it turned out, was wrong. Instead of searching for consensus solutions that could pass with broad, bipartisan support in Congress, the administration from the start seemed to prefer winning ideological battles by narrow margins. About 4 months after President Bush took office, Senator Jim Jeffords of Vermont was becoming deeply troubled by the administration's agenda and what he regarded as their uncompromising style. At the time, Senator Jeffords held the longest continuously Republican seat in the United States Senate. He said publicly that he thought the president's first tax cut was too large and that it would eat up more money than America had and divert resources away from what he cared about the most, education. One evening, he confided his frustration to a colleague of ours, Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut, with whom he had worked on many education issues. That night, Senator Dodd called me late. He said, "I think there's a chance, under the right circumstances, that Senator Jeffords might actually switch parties, changing this balance from 50-50 to 51-49. We decided to keep the lines of communication open and see what developed. In mid-May of 2001, the White House pointedly did not invite Senator Jeffords to a Rose Garden ceremony at which the president announced the National Teacher of the Year, who happened to be from Vermont. As a fellow Vermonter and chairman of the Senate Education Committee, he should have been at that ceremony, but Senator Jeffords was excluded. And that exclusion was widely seen as a snub, the White House's way of punishing Senator Jeffords for speaking out on education and tax cuts. The following day, a Friday, Senator Jeffords was visibly upset and told 2 other Republican senators on the Senate floor that he was actually now considering leaving the Republican Party because he no longer felt welcome. We felt that may have been the end of it, announcing to his Republican colleagues that that was his intention. As soon as the news reached the White House, we thought the White House would do whatever it took to prevent Senator Jeffords' defection. All weekend, we waited for the bad news. I checked my telephone message. I checked the news. I looked on the internet. To our astonishment, the White House never called Senator Jeffords. On Monday, he called me to tell me his mind was made up. He couldn't be a Democrat, but he would become an independent. The next day, he went home to Vermont and made it official. Never before in all of American history had control of the United States Senate turned on the decision of one senator. There were some who urged at the time, when we retook the majority after that decision, that we use our new majority to get even for what many in our caucus regarded as excessive partisanship by some of our Republican colleagues. But I tried to avoid that as majority leader. I believed then, as I believe now, that retaliation diminishes both parties and is corrosive on the democratic process. But the defining event was not Senator Jeffords' momentous decision. The defining event of the 107th Congress was, of course, September 11th. I was in my office in the Capitol, meeting with John Glenn. He and his wife Annie are very close personal friends of Linda's and mine. He had had an early breakfast and just stopped by the office when the first plane hit the first tower. Someone in my staff ran in, broke into our conversation and said, "A plane has flown into the World Trade Center." We turned on TV just in time to see a second plane hit the other tower. Mistakenly, we thought we were watching a replay. Senator Glenn, who certainly knows a lot about flying, said simply, "Pilots don't fly planes into buildings." He knew instantly America was under attack. I stepped into a meeting with other senators in a nearby room. Suddenly, Senator Patty Murray of Washington looked out the window and said, "My God, there's smoke above the Capitol." And we all rushed to the window, watching this black smoke just plume out over the whole city. We could see chaos on the ground below. At that point, a Capitol police officer broke into the room and said, "We're under attack. A plane is coming this way. Get out of the building fast." I was almost physically pulled out of the building, rushed into a car. The police took all 4 congressional leaders to Capitol Police Headquarters 2 blocks away for security. We went to the top floor and pulled down the window shades. There was no evacuation plan at the time. Cell phones didn't work. The circuits were all overloaded. I'll never forget so vividly watching the television as the towers collapsed, standing in line with other leaders to use the one hard line to call Linda, to see if she was okay, and to call our children and family to let them know I was too. After a while, we were helicoptered to one of the secret, undisclosed locations. There we decided that members of Congress would regroup that evening on the Capitol steps regardless, to send a clear message to the world, and especially to terrorists, that we would not allow them to shut down American democracy. On the steps that night, as the sun set, the Speaker of the House and I made short statements. And then someone spontaneously began singing "God Bless America." We held hands, we joined in, singing a little off key, but united as I have never seen the United States Congress. In the weeks that followed, Congress passed an historic series of bills to help the victims of September 11th and to prevent future terrorist attacks, and the war in Afghanistan began. Then on October 15th, 2001, the anthrax letter was opened in my office. That attack remains the largest bioterrorism attack ever on U.S. soil. It also remains today a mystery. 28 people in the Hart Senate office building, including 20 members of my staff, were exposed to 3,000 times the lethal dose of anthrax. Tragically, 5 people, among those presumably exposed to a much lower level of anthrax outside the Senate office, died. The fact that everyone who was exposed in the Senate is healthy today is a result of luck, some very skilled and caring doctors, including one, Dr. Greg Martin, and I believe, we believe, the grace of God. The 107th Congress also saw Americans' faith in the private sector shaken badly as scandals at Enron, WorldCom, and other big corporations robbed tens of thousands of Americans of their jobs and millions more of their life savings and entire retirement security. I'll never forget one immigrant from Turkey who said he'd come to this country in the 50s, taught his kids that if he worked hard and played by the rules, that they would do well in America. He did that. He invested all of his life savings in WorldCom and lost every penny. Broke down, telling me his story. In reaction to those scandals and against strong initial opposition from some in the White House, we passed the most far-reaching corporate accounting reform since the Great Depression. We also faced months of opposition to our calls to create a new Homeland Security Department and establish an independent commission to investigate the reasons for 9/11. The commission, as you know, is working on its final report and is chaired by former Governor Tom Keene and Congressman Lee Hamilton. Even in the final days of the 107th Congress, history continued to be made. Weeks before the election, Senator Robert Torricelli, the incumbent Democratic senator from New Jersey, dropped his re-election bid and was replaced by another candidate. In Minnesota, less than 2 weeks before the election, another Democratic senator, Paul Wellstone, a man I loved, was killed in a plane crash, along with his wife, Sheila, their daughter, and 4 others. His place on the ticket was filled by Walter Mondale, a former senator, vice president, and presidential nominee. Another historic first in the 107th Congress. On Election Day 2002, Democrats ended up retaining a Senate seat in New Jersey that it had appeared we might lose. And in Minnesota, we lost a seat that it seemed increasingly likely we would keep. In the end, we lost our majority. We went from 1 vote up to 1 vote down. What disappointed so many of us wasn't just the outcome of the 2002 election. It was also the startling meanness in many of the races. Most disturbing was the calculated decision by some political operatives to use September 11th as a political weapon in that election. In my state of South Dakota, my fellow Senator Tim Johnson was running for re-election. Out of 535 members of Congress, Senator Johnson was the only member who actually had a child fighting in uniform in the war on terror. His son, Brooks, a staff sergeant in the Army's 101st Airborne Division, served in Iraq, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, and in Afghanistan. In the fall of 2002, while Brooks Johnson was fighting the Taliban, Senator Johnson's opponents ran TV ads in South Dakota comparing him to Osama bin Laden. In Georgia, Max Cleland, a man I consider close to a brother, a man who lost both of his legs and one arm in Vietnam, was accused of being unpatriotic because he dared to have a different idea about Homeland Security. He too was compared in television ads to Osama bin Laden, and he lost his election. Afterwards, he told me, Tom, put aside the physical pain. The psychological pain of that campaign was worse than I experienced in Vietnam. The ugliness, unfortunately, didn't end with the 2002 elections. And let me be clear, it's not limited to the right. A while back, the left-leaning website MoveOn.org hosted a contest for the best 30-second anti-Bush ad. One of the ads they received and posted for a while on their website compared President Bush to Adolf Hitler. There is no excuse for such an outrageous attack. It damages our political discourse and corrodes this democratic system. Lately, I've felt almost sickened at times by the efforts on some on the right and the left to exploit the sacrifices and even the deaths of American service members for political gain. Recently, when Nightline dedicated an entire program to reading the names and showing the faces of service members who have died in Iraq, Sinclair Broadcasting System, which donated heavily to President Bush, refused to air the show on its ABC affiliates. Its lawyers said, "This is contrary to the public interest." My question would be, how is it contrary to the public interest simply to speak the names of soldiers who have given their lives in service to our nation? What kind of war is it when it is somehow unpatriotic to utter the names of our war dead? On the other side, I was appalled to see a cartoon by a man named Ted Rawls calling Pat Tillman an idiot for giving up a multi-million-dollar NFL career to defend this nation after September 11th. Pat Tillman was a patriot, and so were the soldiers whose names were read on Nightline. If people can't see that, on the left and on the right, it is because they've allowed politics to blind them. I've had the privilege of working with some extraordinary patriots in Congress. Bob Dole was the majority leader when I first became the Senate Democratic leader more than 9 years ago. The condition for a good working relationship could not have been much worse. Democrats had lost the majority in the Senate that year. Newt Gingrich had just become Speaker of the House. Bill Clinton was halfway through his first term as president, and Senator Dole was widely considered to challenge him for re-election. When he resigned from the Senate in June of 1996 to run for president full-time, some people urged him to use his farewell address to drive a wedge. Instead, he spoke with pride about the bipartisan accomplishments he had helped forge: the school lunch program that he created with George McGovern, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Americans with Civil Disabilities Act. He also recalled with great fondness 3 men he had met decades earlier in veterans' hospitals in Michigan. They were all recovering from war wounds when he met them, and ultimately he served with them in the United States Senate. 2 of those 3 were Democrats. Nancy Landon Kassebaum is another American patriot. She is truly her father's daughter, a proud Republican. But in 1994, on the eve of another historic midterm election, she was one of 5 Senate Republicans who voted to support and help pass President Clinton's crime bill. In '96, she joined with Senator Ted Kennedy to pass the Kassebaum-Kennedy health bill, which at long last began limiting discrimination in health insurance based on pre-existing condition. There is nothing inherently wrong with partisanship. To the contrary, pride in party and the principles for which it stands can be admirable, but it should be principled. It should acknowledge, as Senator Dole and Kassebaum and others do, that there are things that matter more than political parties. There are lines we should not cross, regardless of the advantage that we think it may give our party at the time. Demonizing those with whom we disagree politically does not serve the interests of democracy. It does not resolve differences. It inflames passions and deepens those divisions. America has real enemies in the world. Creating false enemies among us to score political points does not make us safer. It makes us more vulnerable. And trying to bully and intimidate others into silence or compliance does not lead to progress. It leads to increased polarization and eventually paralysis. There are questions today of enormous consequence facing our nation, questions that will define what kind of nation we are and what sort of future we will leave for our children and grandchildren. How do we balance freedom and security in a post-9/11 world? When Congress passed the Patriot Act immediately after September 11th, we deliberately included an expiration date so that Congress and the public would have a chance to review whether the law was working and decide whether it should be changed, renewed, or simply allowed to expire. In his campaign speeches, the president routinely calls for the Patriot Act to be expanded and made permanent. Is that the right thing to do? We ought to debate that, and people ought to be able to ask questions and voice their ideas freely and openly without being accused of aiding and abetting the enemy if they disagree. 4 years ago, the federal government was just experiencing the largest budget surplus in our history, and economists predicted we would accumulate additional surpluses totaling $5.6 trillion by the year 2011. Today, the budget picture is radically different. This year, the deficit is expected to exceed $500 billion. This year, $500 billion. We're borrowing money at the rate of $1 million a minute from China, from Japan, from Korea, from Taiwan. People talk about repealing the death tax. I worry about the birth tax. Linda and I have 2 grandchildren. The minute they were born, they inherited $30,000 worth of public debt. Is that right? Is that moral? Americans ought to be able to discuss our national priorities and obligations without worrying about being called obstructionist or even worse. Americans are hungry for honest, civil, national discussion and other big questions. I don't have all the answers, but let me quickly suggest 7 specific ways that I believe we can begin to restore civil discourse and bipartisan consensus in American politics. First, I believe American campaigns should focus on real issues, not wedge issues, In 1963, Barry Goldwater proposed to his friend John Kennedy before John Kennedy was assassinated that they make a series of joint appearances the next year to debate the great issues of the day, one-on-one in cities across America. President Kennedy liked the idea. That's how they imagined the 1964 presidential campaign would take place. Together, discussing, debating, and enlightening. Americans today deserve that same kind of honest debate on the issues that truly matter. Second, the perpetual campaign must end. When former First Lady Pat Nixon died in 1993, a reporter was startled to see George McGovern among the mourners. When the reporter asked Senator McGovern why he was there to pay his respects to the wife of a man who had fought so hard and so unfairly, George McGovern replied simply, "You can't keep campaigning forever." Too many people in politics today don't seem to understand this. They get elected to office and continue their feuds as if the campaign never ended. After the ballots are counted, you have to stop thinking about how you can beat the other side and start thinking about how you can work with them to do good and constructive things. Third, we need to reject the idea that civility is weakness and compromise is a sin. Everett Dirksen, the great Republican leader of the Senate when Dwight Eisenhower was president, said, "I am a man of fixed and unbending principles. And one of my principles is flexibility. The result of hardball, all or nothing politics is usually nothing. We need to restore respect for principled compromise." Fourth, this ugly business of impugning others' patriotism because they see things differently or want to try to reach a good faith compromise must stop. It is corrosive and destructive, and it is fundamentally un-American. As President Eisenhower said, "Here in America, we are descended in blood and in spirit from revolutionists and rebels, men and women who dared dissent from accepted doctrine. As their heirs, may we never confuse honest dissent with disloyal subversion." Fifth, we should reject the idea that family members of political figures are fair game. To use the term White House advisor Karl Rove reportedly used to justify outing former Ambassador Joe Wilson's wife, Valerie Plame, as an undercover CIA operative. I've heard my own wife's career misrepresented and her character impugned for no reason other than to damage me politically. I've seen other political families, Republican and Democratic, attacked in similar ways. It is ugly, and it only coarsens the political process, and it should stop. Sixth, we must protect free and independent media. Democracies can't function without informed citizens. Manhattan is fortunate to have the Mercury, one of the vanishing breed of family-owned newspapers. Such independent voices are disappearing very quickly today because of rapid consolidation among media conglomerates, which is one reason so many members of Congress, Republican and Democratic, oppose the new FCC media ownership rules. We can't have a handful of giant corporations controlling what Americans hear, read, and see. We need reasonable rules that protect the independence of the media. And seventh and finally, the media must use their extraordinary freedoms responsibly. They should rake the important muck not just the sensational. There's another Kansan I admire greatly. He was a Teddy Roosevelt sort of Republican, one of the leading voices of the progressive movement in American politics at the beginning of the last century. He ran for governor of Kansas in 1924 as an independent and was branded un-American and finished third after two candidates who were endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. But his greatest work was done in newspapers. He was one of the truly great muckrakers. Of course, I'm speaking about William Allen White, the legendary editor of the Emporia Gazette. In 1922, William Allen White faced arrest and possible jail sentence over his public argument with then the state's governor about labor rights and free speech. In response, he wrote one of his most famous editorials, titled "To an Anxious Friend." After it appeared, the charges were dropped, and White won the Pulitzer Prize. This is part of what William Allen White wrote in that column, which is still true today. Peace is good, but if you are interested in peace through force and without free discussion, your interest in justice is slight. And peace without justice is tyranny, no matter how you may sugarcoat it with experience. Whoever pleads for justice helps to keep the peace, and whoever tramples on the plea for justice, temperately made in the name of peace, only outrages peace and kills something fine in the heart of man, which God put there when we got our manhood. When that is killed, brute meets brute on each side of the line. So, dear friend, put fear out of your heart, he wrote. This nation will survive. This state will prosper. The orderly business of life will go forward if only men can speak in whatever way, given them to utter what their hearts hold, by voice, by postcard, by letter, by press. Reason has never failed men. The 107th Congress was filled with historic events from that first day to the last. Today, enormous new challenges and opportunities confront each and every one of us in this hall this morning. We will not meet those challenges or seize those opportunities if we indulge in the brutal politics of division, if we attempt to silence those who may have other ideas, listening to and working with each other. There is nothing Americans cannot achieve. We proved that on September 11th. We can do so again and again, and in so doing, pass this country on to the next generation just a little better than we found it. Thank you all for giving me the chance to speak my mind. Now I'd be happy to hear what you think and answer some of the questions that I know you may have. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Senator, for an excellent Landon lecture. And as we ordinarily do If you look to your right, there is a microphone, and if you look to your left. And so the senator has agreed to answer some questions. So we have a few minutes here. Why don't we start over here, please?
My name's Tim Northrup. I'm a community member from the surrounding community area. Your speech today was exactly along the line of what I wanted to ask. You've been downplaying the partisanship, and the history of these last two Congresses has been very important to the United States as a whole. With this campaign already turning ugly, how do you, Representative Pelosi as the leader in the House, and Senator Kerry as our president, as the nominee for the presidency, keep this from going into an overly horrible tailspin of a campaign, as well as try to win back both the White House and both houses of Congress without defaming President Bush any more than he already has been?
Well, I believe that what we as responsible leaders in our country today must do is try to build upon what I call the politics of common purpose. I believe that in the politics of common purpose, you respectfully debate the issues. You respectfully draw distinctions, but you don't question the motives of others who may have different views than yours. You look for opportunities to have public debate, not screaming matches. I worry sometimes about the level of discourse on our cable news shows these days. I spoke to the breakfast earlier this morning, and I referred to the cacophony of voices we have in this country as the noise of democracy. And I think the noise of democracy in our country is something that should be embraced, even though it's not always very stereophonic and far too loud than it needs to be. But the noise of democracy certainly beats the noise of violence. We need to continue to find the right balance and that stereophonic sound and speak respectfully of each other as we confront the issues of the day. Take a question over on the left.
Two quick questions. First question, there's been a lot of voices criticizing Congress for not doing a very good job of oversight over this war on terrorism. Last week, Senator Roberts talked for some time about how he believed the solution for this is to eliminate the term limits on the Intelligence Committee. You've come out against this, saying that you'd like to see bigger reforms. So I was just wondering, so the first question is, what reforms would you like to see to improve oversight over this war on terrorism, and would it include eliminating the term limits? And the second big question is, do you think Rumsfeld and General Myers should leave their jobs? For the record.
Well, of course, we're just beginning to review the data that has been collected, first from the Intelligence Committee itself, which has been investigating the pre-9/11 experience and the intelligence breakdown, and will soon release its report to the Congress and offer specific proposals with regard to reforms within the intelligence community. If you had the impression that I was against term limits, I'm sorry I left you that impression. I have been skeptical about extending the term of the Intelligence Committee, because I think by and large turnover in these committees has served a very worthy purpose. And I worry a little bit about providing less opportunity for others to serve on such an important committee, and allowing greater turnover might allow greater perspective and insight, and fresh ideas in that committee where it is so greatly needed. But in a larger context, I'm certainly not adverse and won't oppose it when it comes to the floor later on this year. I think other questions that ought to be explored is that should there be one central director of all national intelligence to coordinate more effectively the different branches? 80% of the intelligence is collected and utilized within the Department of Defense, not the CIA. Should there be an Office of Domestic Intelligence now, with all of its pitfalls and problems? Should we extend the Patriot Act? And what should we do with regard to intelligence gathering now authorized under the Patriot Act? So I don't know that anybody has come to any collective decision with regard to how we reform the intelligence infrastructure within our country. I think it's needed. I haven't come to any final decisions myself. Secondly, with regard to the tragic experience involving prisoner abuse in Iraq. It has been an incalculable disaster, not only undermining our image, reputation around the world, but most likely putting our men in Iraq, men and women in Iraq, in an even more perilous position. There is no doubt that comprehensive and significant new direction is needed. I think it would be a horrific failure if all we did was use those junior ranking soldiers directly responsible for the abuse as scapegoats for a larger problem. I think there is an accountability question up and down the Pentagon, and Mr. Rumsfeld is going to have to make the decision, can he continue to lead with this dark cloud? Can he provide the kind of confidence that we are finding solutions and adjusting to this situation? If all we saw was a Rumsfeld resignation, that, in my view, is not a proportional response to the devastation created by the prisoner abuse. Something more systemic is going on here and has to be addressed in a far more comprehensive way than simply the resignation of one official. Take a question over here.
Yes, who would you like to see as the Democratic vice presidential candidate?
I think that we have several very capable people that Lyndon and I have had the good fortune to know and befriend over the years. Dick Gephardt is a close personal friend. He and his wife Jane, I had the good fortune to work with him for about 10 years as leader. And then, of course, before that, as a colleague in the House of Representatives. John Edwards was one of the brightest and most articulate and energetic new members of the Senate that I've ever had the experience of getting to know, and respected him immensely. Bill Richardson, the governor of New Mexico, has a resume that is almost unparalleled. Wes Clark, I think, would do an outstanding job as former military officer and presidential candidate. I heard him recently, and I thought he gave one of the most profound speeches on national security that I had ever had the pleasure to hear. So we've got a depth of talent that I think serves us well, and only one person ultimately will make that decision, and look forward to the time when he shares it with the rest of us. Question over here.
Yes, you mentioned before that once the American people know the facts, they can reason and make informed decisions. Well, President Bush receives a lot more facts than us. Do you believe he's reasoning and making informed decisions? Why or why not?
I believe that in his heart of heart, President Bush believes strongly that he's doing exactly the right thing. I don't challenge in any way, shape, or form his motivation or how it is he arrived at the decisions he's made. That is his right and his responsibility as president. But I believe that those of us who hold a different view have every bit as much right to express those views and to explain why, as I attempted to do this morning. I think it's important for good political discourse. What troubles me is that some, on both sides, are willing to demean and in some ways destroy the character of those who disagree for short-term political gain. That's what I find at fault in the political system today. And while I disagree with President Bush on many things, I respect him for holding the views that he does, even though I find myself in disagreement on many of the critical questions we have to face in our country today. Yes.
Senator Daschle, I want to thank you for coming here today to share your thoughts and speak with us for the Landon Lecture. I'm a student in the College of Agriculture here at K-State. Grew up on a family farm in north central Kansas and would someday like to return to the family farm. As a member of the Senate Ag Committee, what are some of the steps that are being taken to ensure that America's current and future family farmers are going to thrive and develop in an ever-changing economy, and what kind of support can we expect from your committee?
Very good question. One of the concerns that I have today about agriculture is the concentration of economic power in the hands of fewer and fewer corporate entities. and as a result, the inability that family farms and ranchers have to compete. So I think we have to start with a far more aggressive effort at antitrust to ensure that there is real competition. I'm also concerned about unfair trading practices that are now being experienced and practiced by so many other trading partners around the world. Their unwillingness to allow us to compete fairly in their countries. That worries me a great deal. The third concern I have is the dwindling number of research dollars dedicated to agricultural research. I think research is by far one of the most important elements to success in future generations. It is, in some respects, our seed corn, and we've got to invest aggressively in research, both applied and basic. And I believe it's only through applied research, that is, finding greater value-added opportunities like ethanol and other issues, the biodiesel, that really present agricultural opportunities for future generations. But it seems to me that with a good framework in agricultural policy will be the only way that we can create the future that you and I both want.
So we only have time for one more question over here, and then we have to wrap it up.
Okay, my question is, I'd like to go back to the Iraqi prisoner abuse. I would like to know how we can continue to push our values on another country when we can barely practice them while we were there.
Well, first of all, I think with all due respect, I think your question misrepresents what 99.9% of our soldiers are doing over there. I really believe that what we are trying to do is to give them the opportunity to experience the freedom that we enjoy. I really believe that from the bottom of my heart. I believe inherently that we're trying to do the right thing. I don't think it's right for us to impose a government, and ultimately I think it would be wrong for us to maintain a permanent presence in Iraq. I think ultimately we have to let the Iraqis do what they believe is right for them. But what we're trying to do is to give them that chance by doing three things. First, by instilling greater degree of confidence in their own security than they have today. Secondly, by building an economic infrastructure that had almost been totally destroyed by Saddam Hussein and his government. And third, in place, putting a new political infrastructure that would allow those with an interest and a following to create some representative form of government that ultimately would allow people to make decisions for themselves.
But why
that, to me, is a laudable goal, and that is something that, in my view, is the only goal of the vast majority of American military men and women and others who are there representing our interests today.
But why do we expect them to accept our values when we are sending soldiers with guns into their land?
Well, again, I differ. I don't think that we are expecting them to adopt or to accept our values, and I think the reason we have guns is because we are doing what I said at the beginning, attempting to create a level of security that doesn't exist today. Thank you very much. Thank you all.